The way Judge Richard Calloway looked at me that morning, you would have thought he already knew how my story ended. Not suspected. Not assumed. Knew. That was the part I kept replaying afterward. Not the cold air inside courtroom 4B. Not the whisper of papers being shuffled behind me. Not even the moment my husband of 11 years stood up and prepared to destroy me. It was the certainty in the judge's eyes, the quiet contempt of a man who believed he was looking at someone who had betrayed everything she claimed to value. I sat at the defense table wearing a navy blazer my attorney, Victoria Bennett, had chosen for me 3 days earlier. Professional but approachable, she had said while holding it up in the boutique dressing room. At the time, I had laughed. On that morning, there was nothing funny left in my life. Across the courtroom sat my husband, Ethan Hayes. He wore the charcoal suit I had bought him for our 10th anniversary. I remembered standing beside him in the department store while he complained about the price and then smiled when I insisted he deserved something expensive. Looking at him now, I realized I had spent years mistaking gratitude for love. Then the courtroom door opened. A man walked inside. For one terrifying second, I forgot how to breathe. Because I knew him. And in that instant, before anyone spoke a single word, I understood that everything I had built over the previous decade, my marriage, my business, my reputation, my entire understanding of my own life was balanced on whatever happened next. Then Thomas Carlyle stood. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "the plaintiff would like to present evidence of the defendant's ongoing extramarital affair." The room disappeared around me. But none of this actually began in a courtroom. Disasters rarely do. My name is Lauren Hayes. I was 35 years old when my husband filed for divorce and 37 by the time we stood in front of a judge. Looking back now, I can see the fractures everywhere. At the time, I called them normal. I met Ethan at a professional networking event in downtown Raleigh shortly after my 24th birthday. He remembered my name after our first conversation. He held doors open. He listened when I spoke. Back then, those things felt extraordinary. For a long time, they were enough. We married 8 months later. My mother told me I was rushing into something I didn't fully understand. I told her I knew exactly what I wanted. Years later, I would remember that conversation more often than I cared to admit. By the time everything collapsed, we had built what looked like a successful life. We owned a beautiful craftsman house in the Oakwood district. We had a golden retriever named Cooper, who believed every visitor existed solely to admire him. I had built Summit and Stone Creative from $12,000 in savings and a second-hand laptop balanced on our kitchen table. What began as freelance consulting had become a thriving agency, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. I was proud of that success. Ethan pretended to be. That distinction would eventually destroy us. At first, I blamed stress for the growing distance between us. Ethan worked in commercial real estate, and the market had been unpredictable for months. He came home quieter. He smiled less. Sometimes, I would catch him staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite identify before he looked away. I told myself marriage had seasons. I told myself we'd find our way back. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. While I was building presentations, managing employees, and planning a future I believed we still shared, Ethan was building something too. Not a business. Not a marriage. A case. And by the time I finally realized what my husband had become, he had already spent months preparing to convince the world that I was someone I had never been. I didn't know any of that when I walked into our kitchen on a Tuesday evening in October and saw my husband waiting for me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes at all. Lauren set her bag on the kitchen island and immediately noticed something strange. Ethan was standing perfectly still beside the sink, one hand resting on the counter, his phone lying face down in front of him. It wasn't the position that bothered me later. It was the expression. He looked like a man performing the role of himself. Long day? I asked. He nodded. Mine too. I think I spent 6 hours talking about font choices. Normally, that would have earned at least a smile. Ethan loved making fun of marketing jargon. Instead, he simply watched me walk toward the refrigerator. Is there any leftover pasta? I asked. Should be. I pulled out the container, placed it in the microwave, and turned back toward him. He hadn't moved. Everything okay? Of course, you don't sound like everything's okay. I'm tired, Lauren. The microwave hummed between us. I remember that sound because it filled a silence that suddenly felt enormous. After dinner, Ethan disappeared into his office and closed the door. That wasn't unusual by itself. What was unusual was hearing him talking quietly on the phone nearly an hour later. When I opened the door to ask if he wanted tea, the conversation stopped immediately. He looked startled. I didn't realize you were still awake, he said. It was such a strange response that I laughed. I live here, I said. He laughed too, but only after I did. That should have mattered more to me than it did. Over the next few weeks, small things began collecting in my mind. Ethan started taking his phone everywhere, including the shower. He asked questions that sounded casual until I replayed them later. What time did your meeting end? Was Adrian there? Did you stay long? At the time, I answered without thinking. Why wouldn't I? Adrian Brooks was a contractor working with Summit and Stone Creative on 2 major branding projects. He was talented, professional, and methodical to a degree I found both impressive and slightly intimidating. He was also, as I would eventually learn, being followed. The first real alarm came on a Friday night. I arrived home after a client dinner around 9:30 and found Cooper outside in the backyard. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset. Cooper barked happily when he saw me, but his fur was cold beneath my hands. I brought him inside and found Ethan sitting in the living room watching television. Why was Cooper outside? I asked. He looked up slowly. I forgot. You forgot? Ethan, it's freezing. I said I forgot. There was no apology in his voice, no concern, just irritation that I had asked. I stood there holding Cooper's collar and experienced a sensation I still struggle to describe. Not fear, not anger, more like hearing a distant crack beneath the ice you're standing on. Something underneath us had broken. That night, I lay awake beside my husband and listened to him breathing. 11 years together, and, for the first time, I had the overwhelming certainty that I was sleeping next to someone whose thoughts I no longer understood. 3 weeks later, Victoria Bennett called me. The moment I heard her voice, I knew my marriage wasn't ending because we'd fallen out of love. It was ending because someone had declared war. Lauren, Victoria said carefully, I need you to come into my office tomorrow morning. Why? She hesitated. In every movie I'd ever watched, lawyers hesitated before delivering devastating news. Real life, it turned out, was exactly the same. Ethan's attorney filed supplemental exhibits this afternoon, she said. Photographs, timelines, investigator reports, and a witness list. I sat down on the edge of my bed. A witness? To what? Another pause. To an alleged affair between you and Adrian Brooks. For several seconds, I genuinely believed I had misheard her. My mind rejected the sentence completely. Then, slowly, horribly, I understood that every strange look, every question, every silence over the previous months had been building toward this moment. I walked to the window and stared into the darkness outside. Somewhere in the city, my husband was sleeping peacefully. Meanwhile, my entire reality had just changed. I was wrong. I wasn't wrong because Ethan had accused me of something I didn't do. I was wrong because I still believed the truth would protect me. The next morning, I arrived at Victoria Bennett's office carrying 2 laptops, 3 folders, and a level of determination that bordered on desperation. Victoria had already spread Ethan's supplemental exhibits across the conference table when I walked in. At first glance, they looked devastating. Photographs of Adrian and me entering a hotel on Franklin Street. Photographs of us leaving nearly an hour later. Pictures of us having coffee on Park Avenue. Pictures of us standing close together outside my office after sunset. Separated from context, they created exactly the story Ethan wanted everyone to believe. "Tell me everything," Victoria said. So I did. The hotel meeting had been with a major client staying there during a conference. Adrian and I had used the hotel's business center to finalize a presentation after my laptop charger failed. The coffee meetings were project discussions. The late-night office photographs had been taken during a product launch campaign that required 18-hour workdays. Every memory returned with absolute clarity because there had never been anything to hide. By noon, we had assembled a timeline. By 3 o'clock, we had gathered emails. By evening, we had invoices, calendar invitations, project files, digital timestamps, client correspondence, rideshare receipts, security logs, and 47 separate pieces of documentation proving that every interaction between Adrian Brooks and me had been professional. Victoria stared at the growing stack of evidence. "Lauren," she finally said, "your husband spent months building a narrative." I nodded. Then he picked the worst possible woman to lie about. For the first time in days, I almost smiled. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat alone in my office at Summit and Stone Creative, while the city outside my windows turned from darkness into dawn. I reviewed every document twice. Then, 3 times. Around 4 in the morning, I stopped working and simply sat there. What hurt wasn't the accusation. It was the realization that Ethan had spent months watching me. Watching my schedule. Watching my meetings. Watching my life. The person who had once held my hand during difficult days had transformed into someone gathering evidence against me. I kept asking myself the same question. When had he stopped being my husband and started becoming my enemy? The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. Victoria met me outside the Wakefield County Courthouse at 8:45. She was carrying a leather portfolio and wearing what I privately called her courtroom armor, an expression so calm and controlled that it made everyone around her nervous. "He's going to make this ugly," she said. "I know. Don't look at Ethan." I nodded. "Don't react to anything." "I understand." She paused. "I've reviewed every piece of evidence you brought me. You're telling the truth." The fact that she needed to say that almost broke me. Because somewhere inside myself, after weeks of accusations and suspicion and fear, I had begun questioning whether the truth was enough. We entered courtroom 4B together. The proceedings began with procedural motions. Lawyers argued over technicalities, while I sat perfectly still, my hands folded tightly enough to hurt. Then Thomas Carlyle stood. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed the ending had already been written. "Your Honor," he said, "the plaintiff alleges that the defendant engaged in a prolonged extramarital relationship with Adrian Brooks, a contractor employed by her company." He presented the photographs, the private investigator's report, the timelines. Then he smiled. "We would now like to call Mr. Adrian Brooks." The courtroom doors opened. Adrian walked inside wearing a dark suit and an expression so calm that it immediately terrified me. Because innocent people looked nervous in court. Adrian didn't look nervous. He looked prepared. And in that moment, as he walked toward the witness stand without once looking in my direction, I became absolutely certain that I had already lost everything. Adrian Brooks walked to the witness stand with the calm confidence of a man who had already made peace with whatever was about to happen. That terrified me more than anything else. I had spent the previous month preparing for accusations, evidence, and humiliation. I had not prepared myself for the possibility that the one person capable of destroying my life would walk into the courtroom looking completely at ease. He sat down. He stated his name for the record. He folded his hands. Thomas Carlyle approached with a smile that looked rehearsed. "Mr. Brooks," he began, "could you describe the nature of your relationship with Lauren Hayes?" Adrian looked at him. Then he looked at me. For one terrible second, I saw every meeting we'd ever had flash through my mind, every coffee shop conversation, every late-night project deadline, every ordinary professional interaction that had somehow become evidence in another person's fantasy. Then, Adrian did something no one in that courtroom expected. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "before I answer that question, I'd like permission to play a recording." The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that feels alive. Thomas Carlyle blinked. "What kind of recording?" Judge Richard Calloway asked. "A telephone conversation," Adrian replied. "Between myself and Ethan Hayes. Recorded legally under North Carolina's one-party consent statute approximately 2 months before today's hearing." I stopped breathing. Victoria was already on her feet. "Your Honor, the defense requests that the recording be admitted." "Objection," Thomas snapped immediately. "This is highly irregular." "It's also potentially exculpatory," Victoria replied. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair. "Play it." Adrian touched the screen. The recording began. The first voice was Ethan's. Hearing my husband's voice fill the courtroom felt surreal. It sounded exactly like every conversation we'd ever had at our kitchen table. Warm, reasonable, familiar. And then he started speaking. "Adrian, I know you and Lauren have a professional relationship. I understand that." There was a pause. "But I need you to understand what's at stake for me." I turned slowly toward Ethan. He had gone completely still. "My attorney believes that if I can establish infidelity, I'll have a much stronger position regarding asset division." Another pause. "I'm not asking you to lie." The courtroom remained frozen. "I'm asking you not to deny anything." My entire body felt numb. Ethan continued speaking. "You've been alone together. You've worked late. You've been seen entering hotels and restaurants. People don't need proof, they just need a reason to wonder." The silence after those words felt physical. Then came the sentence that destroyed everything he had spent months building. "I'll pay you $20,000. No one moved. No one breathed. The recording continued. "Just let people assume whatever they want. I'll take care of the rest." Adrian stopped the recording. For several seconds, the only sound in courtroom 4B was the faint hum of the overhead lights. Then I looked at Judge Calloway. The expression he had worn when he looked at me that morning hadn't disappeared. It had simply found a new target. Thomas Carlyle looked like a man who had stepped onto a bridge just before it collapsed. Ethan looked worse. He looked like someone who had just realized there was no version of reality left in which he survived this. Victoria moved immediately. She submitted the recording. She submitted the metadata. She submitted text messages from Ethan asking Adrian to think about the offer. Then, she submitted my evidence binder. 47 separate exhibits. Emails, invoices, calendar entries, security logs, client communications, business records, document after document after document. When she finished, she walked to the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "the plaintiff did not discover an affair." She paused. "He attempted to manufacture one." No one interrupted her. "The evidence demonstrates that Mr. Hayes knowingly created false allegations, attempted to bribe a witness, and deliberately misrepresented professional interactions for financial gain." She closed the binder. "We would like to discuss sanctions." And for the first time since my husband filed for divorce, I watched fear appear in Ethan's eyes. Real fear. Because the story he had spent months creating had just collapsed. And what remained underneath was far worse than anything he had accused me of being. Justice, as I eventually learned, does not arrive with dramatic music or a sense of emotional closure. It arrives in paperwork, in continuances, in hearings scheduled 6 weeks apart, in lawyers speaking calmly about events that have completely shattered your understanding of another human being. The hearing where Ethan's recording was played did not end my divorce. It simply changed its direction. Over the next several weeks, the case transformed from a dispute over marital assets into something far more serious. Judge Richard Calloway ordered additional proceedings. Questions were raised about the private investigator's methods, the attempted payment to Adrian Brooks, and the deliberate presentation of evidence that Ethan knew was misleading. Thomas Carlyle withdrew from representing Ethan less than 10 days later. I wasn't surprised. Some stories become impossible to defend once the truth enters the room. Ethan hired a new attorney. He was older, quieter, and carried himself like a man whose only objective was damage control. There were no more dramatic accusations, no more attempts to portray me as someone I wasn't. There was only negotiation, apology through legal language, and the slow dismantling of the fiction Ethan had spent months creating. The investigation into the attempted witness payment continued separately. Victoria explained the process to me twice, because the first time I was too exhausted to absorb any of it. "Will he go to jail?" I asked. She was silent for a moment. "I don't know," she said honestly. In the end, Ethan accepted a plea agreement involving a misdemeanor charge, probation, and a substantial financial penalty. When Victoria emailed me the final outcome, I stared at the screen for several minutes. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relieved. I felt tired. Not physically tired. Soul tired. The divorce itself concluded shortly afterward. The court determined that Summit and Stone Creative had been built primarily through my individual labor, expertise, and professional relationships. I retained ownership of the company, the client accounts, and the office lease. The house in the Oakwood district was sold. When the final numbers were calculated and the mortgage was paid, we each walked away with an equal share of the remaining equity. Fair, not satisfying, not heartbreaking, just fair. Cooper stayed with me. That had been the only issue I cared about from the beginning. Ethan didn't contest it. I never asked him why. A week after everything was finalized, Adrian sent me a text message. He approached me 2 months before the hearing. I refused immediately. Then I started recording. "I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry." I read the message several times before responding. "You showed up when it mattered. Thank you." We haven't spoken much since. Sometimes, though, I think about the kind of person who walks into a courtroom knowing that telling the truth will explode someone else's carefully constructed lie. That requires a kind of courage I still struggle to describe. I moved into an apartment in the River Arts District. 2nd floor. Large windows. No homeowners association sending passive-aggressive emails about seasonal decorations. 6 months after the divorce, Summit and Stone Creative had the strongest financial quarter in company history. Survival, it turns out, creates a very specific kind of focus. My employees know the broad outline of what happened. They never asked for details. They simply kept showing up, doing the work, and treating me exactly the same way they always had. There was dignity in that. The week after everything ended, my mother called. "I never liked him," she announced. I laughed, despite myself. "You came to our wedding." "I wore beige," she replied. It was the first genuine laugh I'd had in months. Here's what I know now. Marriages don't always collapse because of betrayal. Sometimes they collapse because one person quietly stops seeing the other as a partner and starts seeing them as an obstacle. I spent years believing I would fix things later. Later never came, but I also learned something else. Keep the records. Keep the emails. Keep the receipts. Not because you expect someone to rewrite your life, because one day, someone might try. And when that happens, the truth deserves evidence. As for the front porch of the old house, the realtor told me the young couple who bought it refinished it during their first month there. I hope they sit on it often.